I never thought a single text from my own son could erase 30 years of sacrifice in 1 second. The message came in cold, almost casual, like I was nothing more than a nuisance in their perfectly curated lives. It wasn't just what he wrote. It was the way it dismissed my entire existence as if I had never mattered. My daughter-in-law reacted with a heart emoji to his words, like they were celebrating something I wasn't allowed to understand. In that moment, I didn't feel anger first. I felt something much heavier, silence pressing down on my chest. I realized I had been funding a life where I was slowly being pushed out of it. And what I did next would change everything for all of us in ways none of them saw coming. Before I continue, only if this story truly resonates with you, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now, because I read every single comment and it reminds me I'm not speaking into the void. My name is Richard Miller. I'm 72 years old, and this is the night my family stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a problem they wanted gone. That evening started like any other quiet night in my house outside Chicago, Illinois, but looking back now, I understand it was the moment everything finally broke. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold when my phone lit up with David's name, my only son. For a second, I actually smiled, thinking maybe he was calling to check on me, maybe even to thank me for covering his mortgage again this month. Instead, I opened the message and felt my hands go numb. Stop ruining our lives. Stay away forever. I read it once, then again, hoping I had misunderstood something, but there was no mistake. Before I could even process it, another notification came through, this time from his wife Ashley, and it was just a single heart emoji under his message, like she was approving every word of it. I whispered out loud, alone in that quiet kitchen, "What did I do wrong?" My voice sounded ridiculous even to me. I tried calling David immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. "Hey, this is David. Leave a message," his voice said, casual, like nothing had just happened between us. I sat there staring at my phone as memories started piling up in my head. All the times I had wired money without hesitation. All the months I covered their rent when things got tight. All the excuses I made for them in my own mind. My late wife used to warn me about this moment. She used to say, "Richard, love without boundaries turns into permission for disrespect." And I always told her she was being too harsh. I didn't want to believe my own son could ever look at me like I was disposable. I stood up from the table and walked slowly to the living room, the house feeling larger and emptier with every step, and I kept replaying that message over and over again in my head. Stay away forever. The words didn't feel like anger anymore. They felt like a decision had already been made about me without my presence in the room. I opened my laptop out of habit, not even sure what I was looking for, and logged into my bank account where I saw the recurring transfer I had set up months ago, $11,000 every single month going directly into David's account, labeled under Family Support. My finger hovered over the screen as I stared at it, realizing something I had refused to see for years, that I wasn't helping them survive anymore. I was financing the very distance growing between us. I whispered again into the empty room. If I'm supposed to stay away, then maybe I finally will. But what I didn't know at that exact moment was that buried inside those bank transactions was something I had never questioned before, something that would soon make my entire understanding of my family collapse in a way I could never take back. The morning after that message still felt unreal, like my house had become quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I sat at the same kitchen table in my home outside Chicago, Illinois, staring at a framed photo from years ago when my son David still looked at me like I was his entire world. Back then, he would run into my arms after school, holding drawings made with crooked crayons, shouting, "Dad, look what I made," and I would laugh like nothing in life could ever go wrong. I can still hear my wife, Margaret, in the background saying, "Richard, you spoil him too much," while I insisted that a father was supposed to give everything he had. I did not know then that everything would one day be taken for granted. David was always the center of attention in our home, not because I demanded it, but because I allowed it. When Emily, my daughter, was born, things shifted slowly in ways I did not fully recognize at the time. She was quieter, more observant, always waiting her turn while David spoke over her at dinner tables and family gatherings. I remember one night clearly, when Emily was about 12 years old, she looked at me and said, "Dad, Do you think I matter as much as David? I laughed nervously and said, Of course you do, sweetheart. Do not be silly. But even as I said it, I did not change anything. That was my mistake. Years passed like that. Holidays where David picked the movie, birthdays where his preferences shaped the dinner, and conversations that always bent around his mood. Margaret used to pull me aside in the hallway after family dinners and whisper, You are building a man who believes the world owes him something. But I would brush it off, saying, He is just confident. I remember David once coming home from college during winter break, throwing his keys on the counter and saying, I am not built for normal jobs, Dad. I need something bigger. And instead of challenging him, I asked what he needed to get started. That was the beginning of the financial dependency I now see so clearly. Every month, money started flowing from me to him, at first for rent, then for temporary help, then for things I stopped asking questions about. Ashley entered his life later, and I remember the first time she visited our home. She looked around like she was evaluating value, not warmth. She smiled politely and said, David told me you are very supportive, and I remember feeling proud instead of cautious. Emily, on the other hand, built her own life without asking for much, working 2 jobs during college, never once requesting the kind of support David received without hesitation. One evening, I overheard Emily speaking to Margaret in the kitchen. Emily said quietly, Sometimes I feel like I am invisible in this family. And Margaret replied, You are not invisible, but your father only sees what he chooses to protect. I did not step in. I should have. Now, sitting alone in this house, I replay every small moment that looked harmless at the time, but built something much larger beneath the surface. Even David's tone over the years changed from asking to expecting, from gratitude to entitlement, until I became less of a father and more of a system he relied on without question. I remember one conversation just a few months ago when I hesitated before sending another payment, and David sighed on the phone and said, Dad, this is just what you do for family, as if my entire identity had already been rewritten by him. I did not argue. I never did. And now, after everything, I find myself wondering if that silence was the reason we ended up here, because somewhere along the way I stopped being seen as a person and became something else entirely, something replaceable, something temporary, something they believed would never stop providing. But what they do not know, what none of them seem to realize yet, is that there was a moment long before that message where everything could have gone differently, and I was the one who missed it. The first real shift did not happen with shouting or confrontation. It happened in silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any argument I had ever avoided in my life. It was a Tuesday morning in Chicago, Illinois, and I was sitting in the same kitchen where I had read that message days earlier, but something inside me had already started to move in a direction I could not fully explain yet. I opened my laptop out of habit, went to the bank portal, and stared at the recurring transfer again, $11,000 every month labeled as family support, and for the first time in years I did not immediately feel obligated to continue it. My finger hovered over the keyboard, and instead of panic or guilt, there was a strange calm, almost like I was finally looking at something that had never belonged to me in the first place. I whispered, Not today, and that was the first time I did not act like I always had. Later that afternoon, I received a call from David. I almost answered automatically, but I hesitated for a full 3 seconds, something I never used to do. When I picked up, his voice came through sharp and impatient. Dad, the payment did not go through. Did you mess something up? I remember gripping the edge of the table and answering slowly. I did not mess anything up. There was a pause on the other end, like he was trying to process that tone. What does that mean? He asked. I did not give him a full answer. I just said, It means I am handling it. And then I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not with fear, more like my body was learning a new language it had never spoken before. That same week, something unexpected happened. A former colleague from years ago, a financial advisor named Thomas Reed, reached out to me after hearing through mutual contacts that I might be reconsidering how I was managing long-term assets. He said, Richard, I remember how disciplined you used to be. If you ever want to review things, I am here. I almost ignored the message out of old habit, but something in me said yes instead. We met at a small coffee shop in Naperville, and for the first time in a long time, I talked about my finances without mentioning David. Thomas looked at the numbers and quietly said, "You are not just supporting family. You are sustaining a lifestyle that has no accountability." Those words should have hurt more than they did, but instead they clarified something I had been avoiding. When I came home that evening, I found a voicemail from Emily, my daughter. Her voice was careful, almost uncertain. "Dad, I heard from David that there is some confusion with the payments. Are you okay?" For a moment, I almost slipped back into my old role, the one where I immediately fixed everything just to keep peace. But I did not. I listened to the message twice and did not call back right away. Instead, I sat in silence and realized how rare it was that Emily only contacted me when something was already wrong, not because she simply wanted to talk. The next morning, David sent another message, this time shorter, more controlled. "We need to talk. This is not normal." I read it, put the phone face down, and went outside for a walk for the first time in months. The air felt different, like something had already started shifting in ways none of them were ready to understand. And as I walked past quiet suburban streets, I could not shake the feeling that whatever I had just started refusing was about to bring everything to the surface, whether I was ready or not. The moment everything truly broke did not arrive with warning. It arrived dressed as concern, and that was what made it so convincing. It started with Emily calling me twice in one morning, her voice softer than usual, carefully chosen like she was walking through fragile glass. "Dad, I just want to make sure you are okay," she said, and for a brief second I almost believed this was about my well-being. I told her I was fine, but she hesitated before responding, like she was repeating something she had already been told. "David said you might be going through a phase," she added gently, "and that you are confused about the payments and maybe someone influenced you." I paused. That word did not belong in my world. Influenced. Before I could respond, she continued, "He is worried you are being taken advantage of by someone outside the family." That was the first crack, not in my finances, but in my understanding of how far the story had already been rewritten without me. Later that same day, David called again, but this time his tone was different, calm, almost practiced, like he had rehearsed every sentence. "Dad, I spoke to Emily, and we are both concerned. You are not acting like yourself. Maybe it is stress or memory issues." I remember sitting in my living room, staring at the window, trying to process how quickly concern had been repackaged into a narrative I had never agreed to. "I know exactly what I am doing," I said firmly. There was a short silence before he replied, "Then explain why the payment stopped." That question was not curiosity, it was control. I told him I did not owe him an explanation for my own money. That was the first time I heard him exhale sharply, like I had stepped outside a line he believed I would never cross. Within hours, I started noticing changes I did not expect. A message from my financial advisor Thomas Reed came in warning me that David had called his office earlier that day asking questions about my accounts, presenting himself as someone authorized to review family financial matters. Thomas wrote, "Richard, I did not share anything, but I want you to be careful." He sounded confident, like he expected access. My chest tightened as I read it twice, because it was no longer just about money or family disagreement. It was about narrative control, about who was being believed when I was not in the room. That evening, Emily came to my house unannounced. I opened the door and saw her standing there with a folder in her hands, avoiding eye contact. "Dad, I do not want this to get worse," she said immediately, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "David thinks it might be best if we set up some kind of joint oversight for your accounts, just until things stabilize." I looked at her and asked quietly, "Do you hear yourself right now?" She hesitated, then said something that stayed with me longer than anything else. "We are trying to protect you." "Protect me? From what exactly?" I wanted to ask, but I already knew the answer they had been given did not include me as the source of truth. My phone buzzed again, this time a group message that I had not been invited to directly, but Emily's name appeared in it along with David and Ashley, discussing concerns about my recent behavior, describing me in ways that felt like they were talking about a stranger rather than their father. I read one line that said, "We should monitor this closely before he makes irreversible decisions." That was when something inside me stopped reacting the way it used to. Instead of defending myself, I simply placed the phone on the table. Emily noticed. "Dad, why are you not responding?" she asked. I looked at her and said, "Because I am starting to realize I am not part of the conversation anymore. I am the subject of it. Her face tightened, not with guilt, but with discomfort, like she had not expected me to see the structure behind the words. That night, after she left, I sat alone in the dark kitchen again, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition. And as I opened my laptop one more time, seeing multiple new unauthorized inquiries into my financial records flagged by Thomas, I understood something had already moved beyond repair, because while I had been trying to understand my family had already been preparing to redefine me completely, and the next step they were about to take was one I would not see coming until it was already too late. The calls did not stop, they only multiplied, as if silence itself had become something unacceptable to them. By the next morning, my phone was already filled with missed notifications, voicemails, and messages stacked on top of each other like they were trying to rebuild control through volume alone. The first voicemail was from David, his voice tight, carefully controlled, saying, "Dad, this is getting out of hand. You are not answering anyone. We are trying to understand what is happening." The second voicemail came only minutes later, this time Ashley, softer but calculated, saying, "We are worried about you. Please let us know you are okay. This is not like you." I listened to both without replying, sitting at my kitchen table, watching the light change through the window, realizing how quickly concern could be manufactured when access was threatened. Then Emily called again, this time leaving a message that felt different, more uncertain than before. "Dad, David is saying you are being advised by someone who is influencing your decisions. He is talking about possibly stepping in if you cannot manage things properly. Please just talk to us." That sentence stayed with me longer than the rest, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something I had already started to see forming. I opened my laptop and saw 3 new emails from David, each more formal than the last. The first one asked me to reconsider recent financial disruptions. The second suggested a family meeting with an advisor present. The third one was titled simply, "Urgent clarification required." I did not respond to any of them. Instead, I forwarded them to Thomas Reed, my financial advisor, who replied within minutes saying, "Richard, this is escalating in a way that is not normal. I strongly recommend documenting everything." That word, documenting, felt strange in the context of family, like I had suddenly stepped into something that required evidence instead of trust. Later that afternoon, I received a physical letter in the mail. It was from David, typed instead of handwritten, which already made it feel distant before I even opened it. It said, "Dad, we are requesting transparency regarding your recent financial decisions. We believe your judgment may be compromised. For your own protection, we are prepared to initiate a temporary guardianship review if necessary." I read that line 3 times. Temporary guardianship review. It sounded like something being done for someone else's safety, not something being used as leverage against a father in his own home. I set the letter down on the table and sat there for a long time without moving. My phone buzzed again. Emily this time sending a text. "Dad, please just respond. We are trying to help you." I typed, "I am fine," and then deleted it before sending. That was the first time I realized I no longer knew what answer would even matter. By evening, I started receiving calls from numbers I did not recognize, each one going silent after one ring, as if testing whether I was still reachable. Then came another message from Ashley, more direct this time. "If you do not respond, we will assume you are unable to make responsible decisions right now." I stared at that sentence for a long time, feeling something shift that had nothing to do with anger anymore. It was something quieter, more distant. I walked through my house, room by room, noticing how every space that once felt filled with family now felt like evidence of absence instead. The kitchen where laughter used to echo, the hallway where conversations used to overlap, the living room where holidays used to feel alive. None of it felt like mine anymore. It felt observed, categorized, reassessed. That night, I did not check my phone again. I left it on the counter and sat in complete silence, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything, realizing that even if they called again, even if they apologized, even if they explained, something fundamental had already changed in a way that could not be undone, and I was no longer inside their world in any meaningful way. I was outside it completely, watching it continue without me. The house felt emptier in a way I could no longer explain as just quiet. It was not the absence of voices anymore. It was the absence of expectation, like no one was waiting for me to respond, fix, or provide anything at all. I sat in the living room that evening in Chicago, Illinois, staring at the dark television screen reflecting my own face, and for the first time I noticed how tired I actually looked. My phone had stopped ringing hours ago, not because things were resolved, but because something had shifted into a colder phase where silence replaced urgency. I finally turned it on again, and the first thing I saw was a message from Emily sent earlier in the day. Dad, David says you are refusing all communication. I do not know what is true anymore. I read it slowly, then placed the phone down without replying. That was not avoidance anymore. That was recognition that no answer I gave would land where it needed to. Later that night, I received a voicemail from David, but it was different this time. His voice was not angry or controlled. It was lower, almost exhausted. Dad, I do not understand what happened to you. We used to be a family. There was a pause, and then he added quietly, if you are trying to punish us, it is working. I sat with that sentence for a long time, not because it affected me the way it once would have, but because it revealed how they were interpreting everything through a lens I no longer lived inside. I walked through the house after that, turning off lights one by one, noticing how every room felt like it belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed. In the hallway, I paused at a small shelf where Margaret used to keep family photos, and I picked up one frame showing all of us at a Thanksgiving dinner years ago. In that photo, David was laughing, Emily was leaning slightly toward me, and Margaret was looking directly at the camera with a calm expression I had not appreciated enough when she was alive. I whispered, I think you would have seen this coming, and then I put the frame back down. The realization did not come as a shock anymore. It came as a slow settling, like something heavy finally resting on the ground after being carried too long. The next morning, I received an email from Emily with no greeting, only a short message. Dad, David said you might need help and that we should consider taking steps to ensure you are safe. I do not know what that means anymore, but I am scared. I read it twice, and for the first time I did not feel the need to defend myself or correct the story. Instead, I felt something else, a quiet distance forming between who I used to be and what I was being turned into in their minds. I replied with only one sentence. I am not lost. I am just no longer participating in what this has become. I did not send anything else after that. Hours passed, and the house remained still. No calls, no messages, only the sound of the refrigerator and the wind outside. That evening, I sat by the window and realized something I had been avoiding admitting, that the version of my family I had been holding onto no longer existed in any meaningful way, and what remained was not a misunderstanding waiting to be fixed, but a separation already completed in everything except words. I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them again, I understood that this was not just loss, it was transition, because for the first time I was no longer trying to pull them back toward me, and instead I was beginning to accept that I would have to move forward alone, even if I did not yet know what forward looked like. The first week of rebuilding my life did not feel like progress. It felt like emptiness rearranging itself into something slightly more structured. I woke up earlier than usual every morning, not because I had to, but because sleep no longer carried the same weight it used to. The house in Chicago, Illinois, felt larger without constant noise filling it, and I began filling that space with routines I had ignored for years. I started by organizing my old office room, the one I had not used seriously since retirement. Dust-covered boxes of forgotten files, old business notes, and photographs from decades ago when I still felt fully recognized for my work instead of my role in a family system. One morning, I received a call from Thomas Reed, my financial advisor. Richard, he said, you have more flexibility than you realize. If you want to rebuild your portfolio independently, we can restructure everything under your direct control. I remember sitting at the desk, looking at the sunlight through the window, and replying, then let us do it properly this time. It was not excitement in my voice, it was clarity. Over the next several days, I spent hours reviewing documents, not delegating, not avoiding, but actually understanding where everything stood. Thomas explained everything slowly, and for once I was not relying on interpretation from anyone else. You are in a position to reset entirely, he told me. You are not locked into anything you do not choose. That sentence stayed with me. Meanwhile, there were still messages from Emily and occasional attempts from David, but they were no longer central to my attention. Emily once called and said, "Dad, I think things are being misunderstood on both sides. Can we meet?" I answered calmly, "I am focusing on rebuilding my structure right now. I am not avoiding you. I am rebuilding myself." There was a long silence before she said softly, "You sound different." I replied, "I am different." After that, I stopped waiting for emotional resolution from conversations that only brought confusion. Instead, I started attending weekly financial strategy sessions with Thomas, sitting in a small conference room downtown where we mapped out new investment directions. He once looked at me and said, "Most people your age try to preserve what they have left. You are building again. That is rare." I did not respond with pride, only acknowledgement. At the same time, I began reconnecting with something I had neglected for years, my professional identity. I reached out to a former colleague from decades ago, Robert Hayes, who now ran a consulting group in Chicago. When we met for coffee, he looked at me carefully and said, "I heard you stepped away from everything. People assumed you were fully retired." I answered, "I stepped away from being defined by expectations that were not mine." He nodded slowly and said, "We actually have a project that could use someone with your experience. No pressure, just advisory work." I did not agree immediately. I went home, thought about it, and the next morning I called him back. "Let us try it," I said simply. The first meeting with his team was small, 8 people in a glass conference room overlooking the river. They introduced themselves, and when it was my turn, I said, "I am not here to replace anyone. I am here to understand what still works and what does not." That was the first time in a long time I felt my voice land without distortion. There were no interruptions, no assumptions, just attention. Later that week, Emily sent a short message. "I heard you are working again. I hope it makes you happy." I did not reply immediately. Instead, I looked out at the city skyline from my apartment window and realized something simple but important, that my life was no longer being measured by what others needed from me, but by what I was choosing to build on my own terms. And as I stood there watching the evening light settle over Chicago, I understood that this was no longer about recovery, it was about direction, and for the first time in a long while, that direction was finally pointing forward. The first time I walked into the office as a formal advisor, I noticed how different I felt simply by the way I was dressed. It was a tailored dark gray suit, nothing extravagant, but it carried a presence I had not worn in years. On the left side of my jacket was a small metal name badge that read, "Richard Miller, Senior Advisory Consultant." I remember standing in the elevator of the Chicago Business Tower, watching the numbers rise, and realizing I was not entering as someone waiting for approval, but as someone whose opinion would be asked for. When the doors opened on the 22nd floor, a young assistant greeted me and said, "Mr. Miller, the team is ready for you." I nodded and walked in without hesitation. The conference room was bright, glass walls overlooking the river, and 8 professionals were already seated, laptops open, waiting. One of them, a project manager named Lauren, stood up and said, "We have been looking forward to your input. Your experience is exactly what this division has been missing." I sat down, placed my notebook on the table, and replied calmly, "Then let us see what needs to be fixed." As the meeting progressed, I found myself speaking less about theory and more about structure, risk, and clarity, things I had once applied in my own career before everything became defined by family obligations. At one point, a younger analyst asked, "How do you stay objective under pressure?" I looked at him for a moment and said, "By remembering that responsibility only works when it is mutual." There was a brief silence in the room, not uncomfortable, just attentive. After the meeting, Lauren walked beside me toward the elevator and said quietly, "You have a way of making things feel simpler than they are." I responded, "Most things are simpler than people want to admit." That afternoon, I received an access card for the building and a formal email confirming my advisory role, including scheduled weekly sessions and strategic review responsibilities. Seeing my name attached to a structured position again created a feeling I had almost forgotten, not pride, but grounded direction. Later that week, I attended another session where I was introduced formally to senior leadership. The director of operations, a man in his 50s, shook my hand and said, "We were told you had stepped away from professional life entirely." I answered, "I stepped away from noise, not from purpose." He smiled slightly and said, "We can work with that." That evening, I walked out of the building and paused on the sidewalk, watching traffic move through downtown Chicago. And for the first time in a long while, I noticed I was not thinking about what I had lost, but what I was actively building. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I did not check it immediately. When I eventually did, there was a short message from Emily. I heard you have a title again. I am glad you are doing something that makes you feel valued. I read it once, then put the phone back without responding. Not because I was avoiding her, but because I no longer measured validation through external reflection. As I walked toward the train station, I adjusted my jacket and felt the weight of the badge against my chest, steady and real, not symbolic of recovery, but of position earned through choice. And as the city lights began to reflect across the river, I understood that my life was no longer defined by where I had been pulled from, but by where I was now deliberately standing, and that present moment was already beginning to merge with the future I was quietly constructing. The hospital hallway smelled like antiseptic and quiet fear, the kind of silence that presses against your skin and makes every step feel louder than it should be. I stood near the large glass windows of Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, Illinois, holding a paper cup of untouched coffee that had already gone cold. I was not here for myself, but for something I had been called into without explanation. The message from Emily had been brief. Dad, please come to the hospital. It is important. David is here too. That was all it said. No details, no context, just urgency wrapped in uncertainty. When I arrived, I saw David sitting in the waiting area with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he had been there for hours. Ashley stood slightly behind him, arms folded, eyes scanning every movement around her. Emily was the first to notice me. She walked over quickly and said in a low voice, Dad, thank you for coming. We did not know who else to call. I looked at her and asked calmly, what is happening here? She hesitated before answering. It is about the guardianship review. The hospital needs to evaluate capacity before anything moves forward. That sentence landed differently now than it would have months ago. I had heard variations of it before, always framed as concern, always delivered by someone else speaking on my behalf. David finally looked up at me and said, Dad, we did not want it to come to this, but you have not been responding to anything in a stable way. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that felt rehearsed rather than emotional. I stepped closer and said quietly, I am here now, so talk to me directly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a nurse approached, calling my name, and asked me to follow her into a consultation room. The room was small, neutral, designed to remove distraction. A doctor introduced herself as Dr. Helen Carter and said, Mr. Miller, this is a routine evaluation requested by family members concerned about decision-making capacity. I turned slightly and said, By family members, you mean my son? She did not confirm or deny, only continued with procedure. That was when I realized the structure had already moved beyond conversation. I was now inside a process that had been initiated without me. Emily entered the room briefly and said softly, Dad, we just want to make sure everything is okay. This is not meant to hurt you. I looked at her and replied, Intent and impact are no longer the same thing. She blinked, not responding immediately, then stepped back out. David did not enter at first. Instead, I could see him through the glass wall speaking quietly with a hospital administrator, pointing occasionally at documents. Ashley stood beside him, occasionally nodding, her expression unreadable. Dr. Carter began asking me questions about dates, memory, recent events, financial awareness. I answered each one clearly, without hesitation, aware that every response was being measured against something I had not been shown. At one point she asked, Do you feel that anyone is influencing your decisions currently? I paused and said, I feel that others are defining my decisions in my absence. She wrote something down without reacting. After several minutes, David finally entered the room. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he said, Dad, we are trying to protect you from making irreversible mistakes. I looked at him and replied, or from making independent ones. The tension in the room did not rise. It tightened, like a thread being pulled slowly but deliberately. Dr. Carter stood and said, We will need some time to complete the assessment. Please wait outside. As I stood up, I noticed something subtle that changed everything. Emily avoided my eyes. David was no longer looking at me at all. and Ashley had already turned away as if the outcome of this moment had been decided before I ever arrived. I walked back into the hallway, the fluorescent lights stretching long across the floor, and I understood that whatever was about to be concluded inside that room was not just about evaluation. It was about control, and I was standing one door away from a decision that would determine whether my voice still carried authority over my own life. The door opened without sound, but the shift in the room was immediate, like everyone had been holding their breath waiting for a signal that never came. Dr. Helen Carter stepped out first, her expression controlled, unreadable, followed by a hospital administrator holding a thin folder that now felt heavier than anything physical in the corridor. David stood up instantly, straightening his jacket, his eyes fixed on the doctor as if he already knew the outcome but needed confirmation to make it real. Ashley did not move, but her gaze sharpened, tracking every subtle reaction. Emily looked at me once, then quickly away again, as if afraid that looking too long would change something irreversible. Dr. Carter closed the folder gently and said, "We have completed the assessment." Her voice was calm, professional, detached in a way that made it feel even more final. David stepped forward first and asked, "So what does that mean?" There was no urgency in his tone, only expectation. The doctor paused for a fraction of a second before answering. "It means Mr. Miller is fully oriented, capable of independent decision-making, and demonstrates consistent cognitive clarity across all evaluated categories." The words did not echo, they landed cleanly, like something precise being placed in the center of the room. I noticed David blink once, slowly, as if recalibrating what he had just heard. Ashley shifted her weight slightly, but said nothing. Emily's hands tightened together in front of her, but she remained silent. The administrator added quietly, "There is no indication that any form of guardianship intervention is appropriate at this time." That sentence ended the structure they had been trying to build without ever needing to raise its voice. David finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. It was no longer controlled authority, it was uncertainty trying to maintain shape. "That cannot be correct. We have been observing behavior changes for weeks." Dr. Carter replied without emotion. "Family observation is not a clinical diagnosis." The silence that followed was different from earlier silences. It was not tension anymore. It was exposure. I stepped forward slightly and asked, "Am I free to leave?" Dr. Carter nodded once. "You were never restricted." That distinction mattered more than it should have. I looked at David and said calmly, "You asked for evaluation. You received it." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at me like he was seeing something he had not prepared for, not anger, not rebellion, but distance that no longer required explanation. Emily finally spoke, her voice low. "Dad, I did not think it would come out like this." I turned to her and said, "Most things do not come out the way people predict. They come out the way they are." Ashley exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, and said, "We were trying to make sure everything was stable." I answered without raising my voice. Stability is not built through assumption. There was no argument after that. Only realization settling unevenly across faces that had expected a different conclusion. I picked up my coat from the chair beside me, adjusted it, and for the first time in that hallway, no one tried to stop me. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel their presence behind me, not following, not calling, just standing in the moment where expectation had collapsed into something they could no longer reorganize quickly. When I reached the glass doors leading outside, I paused for a brief second, not because I hesitated, but because I understood that what had just happened was not a confrontation resolved. It was a structure dissolved, and behind me, in that quiet hospital corridor, my family was no longer speaking about me as a subject of concern, but as a reality they were no longer able to define, and that realization stayed suspended in the air long after I stepped into the daylight and closed the door behind me. The drive back from the hospital felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because every stoplight seemed to force the same realization to repeat itself in different forms. Chicago traffic moved around me like nothing had changed in the world, yet everything inside mine had already shifted into a new structure I was still learning how to inhabit. I did not receive a single call during the entire drive, which felt more significant than the dozens I had been getting days before. Silence, once used as pressure against me, had now become something I controlled instead of endured. When I arrived home, I did not rush inside. I sat in the car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking about how quickly roles had reversed without anyone explicitly announcing it. The hospital evaluation had not created this change. It had simply confirmed what could no longer be disputed. When I finally stepped inside, the house felt unchanged on the surface, but I was no longer experiencing it the same way. My phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter. It was Emily. I answered. Her voice was careful, almost fragile. "Dad, are you home?" she asked. I replied, "Yes." There was a pause before she continued. "David is saying the hospital report does not reflect everything that was discussed." I leaned against the counter and said calmly, "It reflects exactly what was observed." Another pause. Then she said something quieter. "He is very upset." I answered, "I understand." That was all I said. Not because there was nothing more, but because anything beyond that would return the conversation to a place I had already left. Later that evening, David arrived without warning. I heard the door before I saw him. The familiar sound of entry that used to signal comfort, but now carried hesitation. He stood in the hallway for a moment before speaking. "Dad, we need to clarify what just happened." I looked at him and said, "No, you needed confirmation. You received it." His expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief. "So you are just going to ignore everything we were trying to do?" he asked. I stepped closer, not raising my voice, not changing my tone. "I am not ignoring it. I am redefining my response to it." Ashley entered behind him, arms still folded, eyes scanning the room like she was trying to locate stability in something that had already shifted. "This is not how family handles things," she said. I replied, "Family does not require evaluation to recognize its members." That sentence landed differently than anything before it. Emily stood near the doorway, silent for a moment, then finally said, "We thought we were protecting you." I turned to her and said, "Protection without consent becomes control when it is based on assumption instead of fact." No one responded immediately. The air in the room no longer carried urgency, only recalibration. David finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. It was less certain now. "What happens next then?" he asked. I looked at him and answered, "What happens next is that I continue living without being interpreted through suspicion." There was a long pause after that, the kind that does not invite interruption. Ashley lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition that the framework she had been relying on no longer functioned the same way. Emily slowly stepped forward and said, "We did not think it would reach this point." I nodded once and replied, "Most irreversible things are not recognized while they are forming, only after they are complete." David exhaled slowly, looking away for the first time. "So where does that leave us?" he asked quietly. I did not answer immediately. I walked toward the window, looking out at the street where evening light was beginning to fade. "It leaves you where you are," I said, "and me where I am." The words were not sharp, but final in a way that did not require emphasis. Behind me, I could feel them standing in the space that had once been familiar, now redefined by absence of shared certainty. Emily spoke again, softer this time. "I do not know how to fix this." I turned slightly and said, "Not everything that changes can be repaired in the way it was before." The room remained still after that, not resolved, not escalated, just suspended in a reality that no longer allowed previous assumptions to function. And as I stood there with the fading light behind me, I understood that this was no longer about winning or losing understanding. It was about acknowledging that understanding itself had already been fundamentally altered, leaving everything that followed uncertain, unfinished, and unresolved. The days after everything settled did not feel like a victory, and they did not feel like loss either. They felt like space. Real, quiet space that I had not experienced in decades of my life. My mornings in Chicago began with simple routines now. Coffee brewed at the same time, a walk down the same street, and work that no longer required me to justify my existence to anyone who refused to see me clearly. The advisory role I had stepped into grew slowly, not because I pushed for it, but because consistency has a way of building trust where noise never could. I was no longer introduced as someone's father first, or someone's concern, or someone to be evaluated. I was introduced as Richard Miller, senior advisory consultant, and that shift carried a weight that felt earned, not given. I started arriving earlier than everyone else at the office, not to prove anything, but because I liked the silence before meetings began, when ideas had not yet been shaped by group pressure. One morning, Lauren, the project manager, placed a folder on the table and said, "We adjusted the structure based on your recommendations. It improved efficiency by nearly 18%. I looked at the report, then at her, and said, "Then keep refining it. Improvement is not a finish line." She smiled slightly and replied, "You do not speak like someone who stepped away from this world." I answered, "I did not step away. I stepped back into it with different boundaries." There was no reaction to that sentence, only understanding. Later that week, I received a short email from Emily. It did not ask for anything. It simply said, "I see you are building something different now. I hope it brings you peace." I read it once and did not respond immediately. Instead, I sat with it for a while, not because I was uncertain, but because I finally understood that acknowledgement and reconciliation are not always the same thing. David did not contact me directly again. The absence of his messages was no longer loud. It was neutral, like a door that had closed and no longer needed attention. I noticed that absence more in how I reacted than in what was missing. I no longer checked my phone expecting correction, explanation, or conflict. That habit had dissolved without announcement. One evening, after a long day of reviewing strategic proposals at the office, I walked along the Chicago riverfront. The air was cool, and the city lights reflected across the water in long, steady lines. I stopped for a moment on a bridge and realized I was not thinking about being misunderstood anymore. I was thinking about what I was constructing next. There is a difference between survival and alignment, and I finally understood it in that quiet moment. Survival is reaction. Alignment is intention. My life had stopped being a reaction to others and had become an expression of choices I could stand behind without explanation. I thought about Margaret, about how she used to say that peace is not something you find, it is something you stop abandoning. I did not fully understand that when she was alive. I do now. I have learned that boundaries are not walls, they are clarity. That silence is not absence, it is often protection. And that being misunderstood is sometimes the cost of finally becoming honest with yourself. If you are listening to this and you feel like you are constantly shrinking to fit expectations that do not respect your worth, I want you to hear this gently. You do not need to disappear to be loved. You do not need to over-explain your existence to be valid. There is a kind of strength in stepping back without anger, in choosing peace without permission, and in trusting that what is meant for you will not require you to betray yourself to keep it. I am not saying it is easy. It is not. But I am saying it is possible. And sometimes, that possibility is enough to begin again. If this story reached you in any way, thank you for being here, for listening, for staying present through every quiet moment of it. If you feel comfortable, you can share your thoughts, or simply where you are watching from. Because connection does not always need explanation to exist. My name is Richard Miller. I am 72 years old, and the most important lesson I carry now is this. Your value is not defined by those who fail to recognize it. It is defined by your willingness to keep standing when they do not. And if you have walked through something similar, I hope you know you are not as alone as it feels. There are more stories like yours than you think, and more strength in you than you have been allowed to see. And as this chapter closes, I want to gently remind you that there are more stories waiting here. Stories about rebuilding, about quiet courage, and about starting over when everything familiar has already fallen away. You can choose to continue watching, or simply sit with this moment a little longer, but either way, you are always welcome to return.